Good afternoon. Welcome to the City Club of Portland Friday Forum. Today is Friday, June 15th, and I welcome you all to the state's premier civic affairs event. I'm Pat McCormick, president of City Club, and I'd like to welcome members and guests alike. Those of you who join us today at the Governor Hotel, and those of you listening on OPB or KBPS radio or watching on Portland Community Media's CityNet 30. Today we will hear about Portland's growing tech startup scene, but first some announcements. I'd like to begin by giving a warm welcome to the City Club's newest members, Dennis Hodge of Slalom Consulting in Portland and Mary Sullivan, principal at Kickstart Alliance in Hillsborough. Thank you and welcome to the club. I should have asked the two of you to stand so that we could recognize you both. Thank you. Welcome. City Club's corporate and media partners are essential to the vitality and sustainability of club activities. I'd like to thank our generous media partners, Oregon Business Magazine. I'd also like to extend our deep appreciation to the Friday Forum's corporate sponsors, ESCO, Morel Inc., Northwest Natural, and Schwabe Williamson and Wyatt. We are grateful for your support and your commitment to the City Club mission. If your company or firm would like to support City Club's mission through sponsorship, please contact the friendly staff at the back of the room or call the City Club office. You're here today because you're interested in Portland's tech startup scene. After this forum, you may even wish that we had more time to dig deeply into this issue. I'm pleased to announce that for this week's forum, we do have that opportunity. On Sunday, June 24th, Rick Turozzi will be the provocateur at a City Club Citizen Salon. In an intimate home setting over a delicious dinner and wine, salon participants have the opportunity to talk with Rick and to expand on the concepts raised here today. We encourage you to sign up for the June 24th salon. Our staff members at the back of the room would be happy to help you sign up following today's Friday Forum. As always, we'll be welcoming City Club members to the microphone after the forum for a question and answer session with our speakers. In addition, we invite all of our audience to locate the index cards on your table, write your questions on them during the forum, and hold them up when I ask. City Club staff will collect those cards, which I will read then from the microphone. We are sure you will come up with some great questions for today's speakers. And now our program. Portland has the potential to be a leading tech startup hub, on par with much larger metropolitan areas. Today's speakers, Skip Newbury and Rick Turozzi, will explain the unique advantages of Portland that we offer startups, and will assert that if the tech community isn't connected to the broader community, we're losing the opportunity to educate the next generation of entrepreneurs and developers. They will offer examples of successful startups that have positively impacted the Portland community and will explain how Portland can support the tech industry financially, politically, and educationally. Skip Newbury is the president of Software Association of Oregon, the state's only trade association dedicated solely to supporting Oregon's software and technology industries. Previously, Skip served as an economic development policy advisor to Portland Mayor Sam Adams, where he helped create Portland's first comprehensive economic development strategy in 16 years, recognizing software as a key industry cluster. While at the City of Portland, Skip's projects included the adoption of the nation's first open-source software procurement policy at the municipal level and the development of resources to support entrepreneurship, like the Portland Seed Fund. With nearly 20 years of experience in the Portland high-tech startup scene, Rick Turozzi has seen both the best and worst this town has to offer as a tech entrepreneur. Today, however, he sees nothing but opportunity for Portland, which has embraced a culture of attention to craft and workmanship that has customers yearning for Portland's products, employees clamoring to be part of the burgeoning startup scene, and entrepreneurs from around the world considering Portland as a home for their startups. And with that, please help me welcome our speakers, Skip Newberry and Rick Turozzi. Gentlemen.
All right.
We wanted to keep this kind of casual, so I think I'll let Skip start with his introduction, maybe give a little background, and then I'll do the same. And then hopefully, Skip and I are fairly familiar with one another. I would count him among my friends, so we're going to keep this a little conversational Q&A, and hopefully it'll drive out some questions for you folks as well.
So by way of a little bit of background, I spent a number of years working in the mayor's office here, working very closely with the Portland Development Commission and various city bureaus on ways that we could develop strategies as part of the public sector to better support tech entrepreneurs in the greater Portland area. And prior to that, I was in the private sector working in software and in and around software as both an attorney as well as someone who was on the business side of things, and had spent a few years in Portland as part of that community. So it was an interesting time when I was asked by Mayor Adams to join his administration and do some work in this area. And one of the reasons why I decided to go that route was there was a tremendous, I think, momentum and sense of opportunity with the technology community here in Portland. Having worked and lived in places like New York and Boston, also in many respects vibrant tech hubs, Portland really to me had a sense of community that I didn't see anywhere else within the software and tech communities. And that was a great asset. And it's something where there's an eagerness on the part of people here to connect and collaborate. It doesn't always work out that way, but there was an eagerness, and that's something that, whether it's the public sector or an organization like the Software Association of Oregon or an accelerator or incubator like Pi, there's opportunities to serve as connectors within that community. And, the old open source adage that, if you have a problem, if you got multiple eyeballs on it, it becomes sort of a diminished problem overnight. And so the more people you have working together to solve some of the problems on the part of our community here, the better the results. And when I was in the mayor's office, what we saw was a lot of tremendous opportunity within the community here and tremendous growth. In just the 3 years that I spent working in that office, we saw a number of trends emerge, which we can talk a little bit about today during our conversation, all of which point in a direction that there's something happening here. And it's that excitement and enthusiasm that I think is infectious, and there's a lot to talk about and share with a broader business and civic community, because I think this is one of the bright spots in Oregon's economy right now. And we need to think about ways that we collectively as a community, even broader than tech, can help support it and grow.
Thanks, Skip. I wanted to give you a little bit about my background, just as kind of an analogy for folks who might not feel like they have a foothold in the tech scene or might not feel like they have anything to contribute to the tech scene. I was an English literature major. I don't write code, and I get to do things like this, and I kind of think back and I go, yeah, I write a blog. Why am I up here? Why did I get chosen to do this? And it's simply because of involvement. So I've been in Portland about 17 years. I've always worked in software, web, high-tech startups, usually in marketing or Marcom roles. About 5 or 6 years ago, I was noticing we were starting to come out of the doldrums of what had been the dot-com days, and we were starting to see a new generation of people building startups and pursuing dreams, and they were small and disassociated. I would often talk to people, 2 or 3 people in different areas of town who were all working on exactly the same problem and had no idea that anyone else in town was pursuing that problem. So out of sheer laziness, I started the blog because I couldn't talk to everybody and connect everybody. So I started Silicon Florist and basically just started covering what was going on in the startup scene. And dumb luck, right timing, whatever it was, that wound up being a go-to resource for a lot of the people working on startups today. Because of that, again, because I sat down at 2 a.m. one night and started writing blog posts, I was approached by folks from Wieden & Kennedy about 3 years ago. Wieden & Kennedy is an advertising agency here in town. You may know they do work for Nike and Coca-Cola. Nowadays, they're most often known as the Old Spice Guy place. So they're the ones who put the Old Spice campaign together. They had some empty space in their building, and they had, as Skip has alluded to and I've kind of talked about, this sense that there was something happening in the Portland startup scene that hadn't quite gelled yet, but could use some help coming together. And so a guy named Rennie Gleason, who is the Global Director of Digital Strategy at Wieden & Kennedy, I always almost stumble over that, but he approached a few of us in the startup scene and asked if we would be interested in helping them start a co-working space. Co-working, for folks who aren't familiar with it, is the concept that a bunch of small companies sit in a wide open space like this and work as small little units, but nobody really has the overall lease responsibility. They all kind of share the rent, that kind of thing. So it mitigates risk for smaller companies and provides some peer mentoring. They wanted to establish that kind of space for startups in Portland. So we said, yeah, okay, that sounds like fun. We'd been thinking about trying to do that anyway, so now we get at least somewhere we can do that. And that's when we started Pi. The original it's Portland Incubator Experiment, but Dan Wieden loves Pi, so we thought if we called it that, he'd approve it. So that's why we went that direction. What we were going to do with Pi was create a curated co-working space where we would invite interesting people in town to come sit and work out of the space. That was really the only premise. We got pretty lucky with that space and how we curated it. One of the founding companies at Pi is a company you may have heard of called Urban Airship here in town. They handle, if you have a smartphone of any sort with any kind of application on it, they're likely serving you push notifications. They work for companies like Groupon and ABC and Disney, ESPN, all that. They started at Pi as 3 guys around a desk. Actually 4, but one of the guys still had to have 2 other jobs while they were doing the startup. And they also took advantage of the unemployment program that allows laid-off workers to start a startup as opposed to looking for a job and still earn unemployment benefits. So they're kind of a nice story for Pi. Again, started as 4 people. Last time I talked to their CEO, Scott Kveton, they were about 82 people. I would imagine they're probably larger than that now since I only talked to him about 2 days ago. They continue to grow and are doing very, very well. They have about $20 million in funding from venture capitalists. Another company we had the opportunity to work with there is a company here in town that used to be called PHP Fog. They're now called App Fog. And they're an interesting story of Portland entrepreneurship. The founder of AppFog is a guy named Lucas Carlson, and he was doing a little work for a friend and was having a really more difficult time than he should have had putting this application he was building online. And in the languages he generally wrote in, there were services that allowed people to rapidly post applications to the web or support those applications on the web. And he's like, why isn't there this for PHP? So he sat down late one night through coding, basically wrote up a blog post and posted it to a group that had a lot of developers on it. It's called Hacker News. It's associated with an accelerator in the Valley called Y Combinator. So he posted this post to Hacker News and said, this seems really dumb, this doesn't exist. If I built this, would anybody be interested in using it? Thought nothing of it, went to bed, woke up the next morning and had 800 people who had already signed up to use his product. So he's like, maybe there's a business here. So as soon as we saw that, we said, Lucas, come on, why don't you come work out of Pi, hang out with us. And so PHP Fog, now AppFog, got their start out of Pi, and it was great to see them grow big enough and get their own office space. I think they're up to 30 or so people now, and that was about two and a half years ago. And then the final kind of serendipitous arrangement that Pi was lucky enough to be part of is a company in town called Simple. There's a guy named Alex Payne who, if any of you are familiar with Twitter, he was like one of the first engineers hired at Twitter. So very early, he's the guy who had to deal with that summer of fail whale and all that stuff when Twitter was going down all the time. Super talented, really great guy. Decided he wanted to move to Portland. And as soon as we heard that was happening, we immediately started recruiting. Well, you need to work out of Pi because obviously this is where you want to be. And we were super excited. We're like, oh, we're going to be Twitter's Portland office. We're going to be the only regional office. And about 24 hours later, he quit Twitter. So we were the regional office for Twitter for that short period of time. And then he went on to co-found what was then called Bank Simple. And their company is basically reinventing the consumer experience with banking. So things like, why should I have to manage a checking account and a savings account? Why can't my money just work for me? Why can't I deposit checks by my phone? How do we make these things more simple? So they're aptly named. The best part about that story, Alex started working out of Pi, started helping build the engineering and development shop out of Pi. And turns out Simple, which was headquartered in Brooklyn, New York, and had an office in the Valley, came to Portland for an offsite. Everybody fell in love with the town, and so they decided to shut down the other two offices and move Simple headquarters to Portland. So they're now headquartered here as well, which is an awesome story. And so about 18 months ago, we said, we seem to be pretty good at like picking people who are doing interesting and amazing things. Maybe we should be a little more prescriptive and intentional about that. And that's when we formed this new version of Pi, which we refer to as a tech accelerator. Even though incubator's in the title, we call it an accelerator. And the idea there is that we have a formal application process. We pick a handful of startups, give them a little cash, and put them through a 3-month period of intensive mentorship and scrutiny and beating them up and making them work ridiculous hours to build products faster and move further than they would be able to in the outside world. A couple of the companies that have come out of that program so far, we've done one official program. We just closed applications for the next program. Sorry, but you guys are going to have to wait for the next one. Two of our success stories out of the first group, a company called VenScreen, which showed up for their Pi interview as two guys with a basically prototype of their product, left Pi 4 months later with $12 million in funding and 40 contractors or employees working for their company. So that's pretty good growth for a 4-month period. Another company called Cloudability, which will remain in Pi as one of our startups in residence for the next class, has gained a whole bunch of funding and have grown to about 8 to 10 people now. So while I'm not good with the metrics, hopefully we'll get Skip to talk a little bit more about the economic impact. Some of those anecdotal stories about these are the types of things that are happening in Portland, and these are just the companies we were able to help. There's another, dozen that are doing amazing things just on their own. So maybe we could talk a little bit about, from Skip's perspective, what kind of economic impact are we starting to see from this new generation of startups?
So one thing that's interesting, and this gets to some of the quantitative data behind this, there's something happening here, sort of sensibility. And if you look at the last 10 years, there's an interesting window that's open right now for the Portland area. And by that I mean in terms of wages. Software, the average or the median wage for software is upwards of around $90,000 a year right now in the greater Portland area. And if you look at the average median wage of all other industries in the greater Portland area, it's around $47,000. So to me, that says there's purchasing power on the part of the employees who work within software and tech. And with that comes an attractive quality to the region that can be used for purposes of recruiting and retaining talent in this area. The other thing that's interesting is if you switch to the employer side of it. So what does this region have to offer the average software or technology employer? And there's really two factors that are I think, interesting. One is that the average tenure of a technology employee in the greater Portland region is measured in years, whereas you compare that to several years, in fact. If you compare that to Silicon Valley, there are people jumping ship every 8 months, 18 months looking for the next gig. There, the idea of diversifying your portfolio as an employee is moving to the next pre-IPO hot company, hoping your stock options vest, and then moving on to the next one. And it's great for some employees and top tech talent, but not so great for employers who are looking to build kind of lasting wealth in a long-term company. So with that, I've noticed a couple of things over the last several years. With that, the longer tenure of employees here in the Portland area, there's another thing that's emerging, and that is Silicon Valley is one of the sort of other markets that are within the region that are also strong in software and tech startups in particular. There's a bit of an overheating. You're starting to see some companies there look to expand and diversify where their operations are, whether it's software development groups, whether it's back office, like the people who are doing HR, accounting. Well, they can't always afford to live in Silicon Valley anymore. So the question is, where do they stick those operations? And there's been some interesting movement over the last couple of years with those companies expanding into the greater Portland region, trying to find places where employees are going to stick around. There's decent schools, decent quality of life. The cost of living is affordable, at least compared to Silicon Valley. And so those are all very attractive things. Talking to a CFO of a company, a major software company in Silicon Valley recently, he said one thing that he was looking at when he was looking at Portland and a couple of other places around the country for expansion was the fact that Portland in particular had about a 15 to 30% cost savings on talent compared to Silicon Valley, and I would say it's probably closer to the 15% when you compare the wages to Seattle. Now, that would be cause for concern if you also didn't kind of view that in the context of the purchasing power that also exists on the employee side. So I think that, that window that I mentioned that's open now is something we need to take advantage of as a community. And that's one thing that at the Software Association of Oregon we're trying to do more of. In other words, we're trying to better promote our software companies and tech companies within the state by letting them tell their stories in an authentic way. And another thing that I'll mention is that in terms of publicly available data on software and tech, that was one thing that caused me to beat my head against a wall frequently in the public sector when I was working in economic development, was the fact that, if you look at industry classification codes, they are horribly inaccurate, or not inaccurate, but imprecise when it comes to describing software and tech. When you've got something that stops at computer software services, that tells you very little about the type of company. I mean, Rick mentioned just a couple of companies that have emerged from Pi over the years, and they do vastly different types of things, and even within the computer software services umbrella. And so what we decided to do over the last several months was create a database and website which a local developer who works out on the west side at McAfee and Intel came up with the URL that we use, which was techlandia.org. Portland Software wasn't quite doing it for the rest of the group. So what was interesting about that project, apart from the name or the brand, was looking at creating a database of software and tech companies within the region. And that provides some context, some critical mass. And so when we're talking about who's here, what they're doing, we now have a way to accurately describe that and depict it. And so with hundreds of software and tech companies now profiled on that database and website, we can refer to that when there's a press event or there's a really great success story, like when Simple decides that they're going to consolidate their headquarters into Portland. having already had operations in New York and San Francisco, respectively. Well, that's a great story, but it stands alone. So if you can tie that to some context and say, look at all the other great companies that are here within that space, this is the reason why they chose the Portland area, that becomes a really compelling value proposition that we can use to promote the region to other companies that are looking to expand and new up-and-coming entrepreneurs that really want to move into the area and start their next big thing.
Yeah, we're lucky enough to have another one of those folks, a guy named, now I'm totally spacing his name, Joe Stump, who runs a company called Sprintly. He's been an engineer at several successful Bay Area startups and finally decided that he was going to move to Portland, and we've been lucky enough to have him spending some time with us at Pi. So we're starting to see that kind of thing. One thing, as you were talking, I wanted to touch on, kind of dawned on me. You know, I talk to a lot of people who are like, I don't really have much interest in that tech thing, you know, or the startup scene specifically. So what does it mean to me? How does it impact me? And one of the things I've noticed, because I don't actually do anything, I just kind of sit back and watch other people do things, and then I tell people that they're doing those things. So is thematically across Portland as a city, every entrepreneurial venture or small business that I see has this attention to craft and detail and really this appreciation for workmanship. I don't care if that's the newest tech startup. I don't care if that's a food cart or a brew pub or, you know, somebody making bicycle helmets like they do here, or cool jewelry out of recycled skateboards, like Maple XO does. They make some sweet iPhone cases too, if you have an iPhone. Everybody has this attention to craft. And because of that, one of the things I've seen most compelling about the economic impact of these companies, which tend to be very conservative with capital and run very, you know, we say they run very lean. Mostly, their overhead is mostly just people. They've got laptops and they've got people, and they're building products that way. But what they do is contribute to the economy with like-minded people. So these guys and women don't get done working and, you know, go crack open a Budweiser and order a Domino's pizza. They go to the food carts, or they go to the local brew pub, or they visit Distillery Row, and most likely they bike home on a bike that they probably bought in Portland with their nutcase helmet on so that they're being safe. And, you know, they really contribute back to the society and really kind of talk with their money about the culture that keeps them here. And they continue to support that culture. So from that perspective, that's another one, again, quantifiable, anecdotal. Like, that's another one that I can't really put a number around, but it's really interesting to see that impact, especially in somewhere like the Pearl and close in downtown here, where a lot of these startups have decided to headquarter. And Old Town. We're starting to see Old Town kind of turn over into this startup scene as well. So even if you're not interested in tech, there's some of that. They're providing some support for some things you may be interested in. The new restaurant that's opening up, or, you know, the latest boutique hotel that's decided to relocate downtown. That impact is being felt, but it's not always obvious.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting sort of follow-on point too. Taking a step back and talking a little bit about sort of the notion of a traded sector industry cluster. You know, in other words, the software industry. Why was that chosen for the city's economic development strategy? Well, when the city was putting that together, they were looking at a number of different things, and one of the big factors was, you know, how can you know, industry sectors that generate relatively high wages and have companies that primarily sell to markets outside of the state of Oregon. You know, what are some of the supports that can be provided to further enhance the growth of those industries? And the external, or the sort of follow-on to that is that you have, because they pay relatively high wages, you have people working for those companies in those sectors going out and, contracting with lawyers and accountants and, getting stuff at the local bakery and buying, consumer products in the local market. And so the thought there with the traded sector notion is that you're trying to focus on those drivers of the economy that are going to have the biggest impact, not only within those little narrow bands, but also more broadly as those people earn their wages and then redistribute it throughout the local economy.
Yeah, we're talking about a lot about what we see happening right now, or what we've seen happen in the recent past. I was wondering if we could just spend a few minutes, like, where's the next opportunity? What are we seeing as the next thing that's coming down the road for us?
Sure. Well, one thing that's interesting is looking at investment capital that's been flowing into the greater Portland region over the last 10 years. And there have been ups and downs, especially since the dot-com boom, the first boom, 2000, and bust in the latter half of that year. And where you see an uptick is with venture capital. Unlike a lot of other regions around the country where you typically see, if there's a lot of venture capital activity, it's usually driven by a combination of biotech or bioscience and usually some software IT-related investments. In the case of Portland, software is roughly 50% in this past year of all VC activity in terms of deals. And that's unusual. It goes to show that it's really attracting the lion's share of venture capital activity to the region. And I think that's just one little indicator or one metric that can be used to measure the vibrancy of a technology community, especially tech startups, because they're looking for that growth capital to accelerate as quickly as possible. And so that's something that we're looking at trying to encourage more of, and building networks to other centers of capital around the region and the country. And so as an example, we've looked at a couple of different opportunities to bring companies to other markets, companies from Portland to other markets that are looking for that kind of capital, to introduce them to investors that already have some tie here, or that maybe just want to learn a little bit more about the types of companies that are available here in the Portland market. We launched, along with the Techlandia database and website, there was an announcement that there's this program called Portland 100. And it's a great example of, just like Techlandia, just like the Seed Fund, a lot of the things that you're constantly hearing over the years that are great support sort of mechanisms, if you will, for the tech entrepreneur community are really public-private ventures. You have, the City of Portland, City of Hillsborough contributing some money to the Seed Fund. You have PDC, which spent an inordinate amount of time helping to figure out how that kind of works from a financing standpoint within the city charter and limitations there. And then with the Portland 100 program, yet again, you have an idea that was generated by one of the more successful entrepreneurs locally in recent memory, Nitin Khanna, who sold his business for, I think it was almost $500 million, raising no outside capital with he and his brother. So they had a massive exit for the two of them. And so he's now turned into one of the more prolific angel investors in the local market, helping these new up-and-coming companies to grow and scale. And he came up with this idea for a program that would be kind of a virtual accelerator, if you will, for companies that are high growth, primarily software companies, but it could apply to others as well. And the thought is that you wrap a series of services and advice and mentors around these companies to help them grow based on identifying a few key sort of roadblocks that those companies face that are preventing that sort of true hockey stick growth. And out of this this process and this sort of concept, PDC was really instrumental in helping to flush out the business plan behind it, and to help gather together the right sort of stakeholders within the community to say, okay, let's kick the tires on this thing a little bit and see see what it looks like. And so you've got this board now that's part of this that consists of, PDC, Software Association, but more importantly, a whole host of really accomplished entrepreneurs and executives from the tech startup community who can help kind of give back. And this program, I think, is just one example of something that, because of Portland's relative size, we're not a huge market by any means. We can still be a bit quick and nimble. And so all these different resources, whether you're talking about PI or the Seed Fund or Upstart Labs or the Software Association or OEN or PDC, a combination and aligning of these resources to help companies as they scale is something that I think is not only important for us to do, but imminently possible. Because of the size of the market and because of what we've already kind of achieved is a track record. I think some of these programs that are already up and running are doing great things and producing dividends already. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm really part of the reason I also serve on the board of the Software Association of Oregon, and part of the opportunity I see for Portland in the coming months and years is this attracting larger tech companies to town. So some of this has already occurred through acquisition, right? We have an eBay office, we have some Google presence here. Microsoft just consolidated a lot of their folks down in the Pearl in their new office, and I think there's when you look at the landscape and see companies like Facebook, which already have a substantial presence in Oregon with Prineville and their project at Oregon State Open Source Labs, and they're opening regional offices. That seems like there are good opportunities there for us to attract some of those other entities here. And what that does is help. It's kind of like counterintuitive, but that actually helps the startup scene, having some of those larger entities move into town, because what it does is what Skip described earlier. The reason people move to the Valley is the same reason that people move to LA. It's like, well, I'm an actor, I'm going to move to LA, I'm sure I'll get a job somewhere. There are plenty of jobs there. The Valley's got that same thing going for developers. It's like, okay, I might not get hired by Google or Facebook, but maybe I'll wind up at Instagram, or maybe I'll wind up somewhere like Path that's going to go big. There's that safety net for them. Even if I get the job and I don't like it, I'm willing to move there because I could move somewhere else. Portland is just beginning to mature into that kind of town. We're starting to move away from being a town that people have to, either move just for lifestyle or have to really make a big decision to move here to somewhere where it's, well, yeah, obviously I could move to Portland. I can make that happen there, and if it's not working, then I'll move somewhere else. And then the other thing we're starting to see take place, which I think is really interesting, and Skip and I talk about this quite a bit, is Portland companies opening Bay Area offices or acquiring. Urban Airship, for example, acquired a Bay Area company, so they have an office in San Francisco. And that creates that almost like even more defined pipeline of potential talent coming to town. So that's kind of what I'm looking forward to over the night, just watching that kind of come to fruition.
That's it. Rick makes a great point about the importance of looking at something as an ecosystem. So we're talking a lot today about tech startups, but we've also talked a bit about data that really describes more than just that. It's also the software and tech industries generally in the region. And so as you look at the ecosystem, you've got typically a lot of churn and risk at the early stage companies. And occasionally you've got some companies that really shoot out of that and they're high growth. And then the question is, how do you provide some key services to those companies to help them scale? How do they broaden their networks and get the resources that they need, whether it's just advice, whether it's capital to further fuel that growth, or whether it could be flexible space that's something that they can accommodate, that can be used to accommodate that growth over time. There's a number of different things along the path, and you've got companies like WebTrends and Tripwire and Jive through a good part of its life cycle, and Thetis and Coaxis, all very large, well-established companies that continue to innovate within the region and are headquartered here for the most part. Jive is, they moved their headquarters a few years ago, but they still have a huge economic impact here with, over, 200 employees locally in the market. And a lot of their executives who are here still continue to give back. And so with all of that, you have to look at what are some of the services that we can help as organizations provide to different layers and connect up as those companies scale. And with the Software Association of Oregon, what we've been trying to do is take a traditional trade association model, which used to be premised on putting a bunch of people in a room for an event on a regular basis and hoping something good came out of it, and instead looking intentionally at what's an economic development strategy with some key metrics that we can measure the success of the organization against and the performance of the organization against. And so we've focused on 3 strategic areas, and that's industry promotion, talked a little bit about that earlier. The assumption there is that most software companies, including the early stage tech companies, don't necessarily sell within the state of Oregon. They're actually looking to get at markets that are outside of the state and are global in some cases. And then the other thing that I'll point out is that we're, of course, focused on advocacy, as most good trade associations are. And then the third area is connections, people, companies, and markets. And I mentioned earlier this importance of looking at networks. So, the idea of connecting these early stage companies to networks of investors, of talent, of capital outside of the state is so important for the future success of the tech startup community. And Rick, I have a question for you that relates a little bit to something that we've seen in the last couple of years, which is a light being shown upon Portland saying, wow, this is a high growth export market as well. And IT and software and computer electronics manufacturing accounts for a huge portion of that, upwards of 60%. So the question is, at the tech startup stage, considering that those companies are oftentimes going after truly global markets, what are some of the things you're seeing in the way of trends, and how can we as a community help to either promote or make it easier for those companies to reach the markets they're trying to get to?
Yeah, and the thing we see most often in Portland, if you're an executive in the Portland startup scene, you're not in Portland very much. I mean, you travel a ton, whereas if you're in some other towns, people will come see you. So what we're seeing, anything that we can do to help facilitate that, inbound, outbound kind of activity, because people are either coming to see you or you're going to see them. Any of the companies, and I should have mentioned when I was talking earlier, Intel has truly increase their presence about what they're doing with the tech startups and folks around here. So people like that have a global footprint, the Microsofts and Googles and Intels of the world, sharing their knowledge about how they approach a global market. At Pi, we're trying to wrestle with it from an accelerator standpoint. So what we've done with this class is we've established partnerships with a tech startup accelerator in Nairobi, Kenya, called iHub, that is basically emerging technology, like what's the lowest level of technology that can be supported in emerging countries. And then we also partner with a startup accelerator in Tokyo, Japan, which is obviously the most highly commercialized and consumer-driven market on the globe. So trying to help educate people that just because what you do seems to work in Portland or seems to work in the U.S., if you're truly going to grow and scale, you need to take a much broader perspective on what's going on there. And that kind of leads in well to one other thing I wanted to touch on, which how do you get involved? Like, if this is interesting to you and you're like, I think I have something to add here, first thing I would say is something I tell every single one of our mentors: common sense is not common. So even though you think about this stuff day in and day out, you've got something to contribute to a startup, or you've got something to contribute to an entrepreneur by simply sharing that knowledge and taking a few minutes out of your day for a cup of coffee with somebody to talk through the issues that you think about and know cold, but they don't know because they've never done that before. And then the other thing is these companies are extremely efficient with capital, which means they need very little investment to move very far. So if you have interest in being an angel or helping support those companies, that's another really good way to get involved with the community. And we're getting the cutoff. So, but I wanted to make sure we threw that out there, that there are ways for you to get involved. I'm happy to talk to anybody. Skip's got a great mentoring program as well, so please get in touch with us. Thank you.
Thank you both very much for a very informative conversation, and the conversation isn't over. It's time now for our questions and answers. Asking questions at City Club meetings at the City Club microphone is a privilege of membership, but all of you at the table who have had cards, if you have a written question, please hold it high so a City Club staff member can collect it from you. Thank you. The first question for our speaker, as always, will be from our Friday Forum host, Bill Holmer. Bill is president of the First Princeton Corporation and an accredited senior appraiser, ASA, in business valuation with the American Society of Appraisers. Bill first joined City Club in 1999 and currently serves as board treasurer.
Thank you, Pat, and thank you, Skip and Rick, for a tremendous presentation. My question is directed at you, Skip, but Rick, feel free to chime in if you like. New tech startups are very much dependent on angel investors and hopefully eventually venture capitalists for their funding. Several weeks ago, we had Secretary of the Treasury Timothy Geithner here speaking to the City Club, and the administration has proposed increasing the tax on capital gains from a current rate of 15% to 39.6%. And so my question to you is, what impact do you think that will have on the availability of funding for high-tech startups?
That's a good question. The capital gains tax rate, both at the state level and otherwise, continues to be an issue that comes up when I'm talking with executives of local software companies. Where it's an impact is when someone is looking at moving towards a liquidity event or an exit at some point in the life cycle of their company, and they might be saying, okay, well, all things being equal, except for this one little sticking point in the form of the capital gains tax, where am I going to locate my company? And as I move towards that exit or that liquidity event, that's something that will cross the mind of most founders, if not organically, then by their accountant or advisor. And so some people will say, you know what, it's important that we go through with the exit where we are, and yeah, we might take a little bit of a hit, but I think it makes sense to, all things considered, go through with it where we are. Others have said, you know what, I think I'm going to move. I need to go to a more favorable environment that has a little less tax liability. But it's one of many factors that most companies will consider throughout their life cycles. And the other thing with capital gains that I'll mention is that at times you look at, on the angel investor side of things, it comes up from time to time that people are saying, well, what kind of a hit am I taking should I decide to locate in an area that has a high capital gains tax and do investments in early stage tech companies there? Again, it's something that is usually one factor of many to consider. You look at a couple of other tax environments like New York, San Francisco, Silicon Valley. They have some of the most onerous and sometimes most onerous tax sort of environments, but also a lot of regulation when it comes to operating businesses, yet they continue to thrive as innovation centers. So it's complicated. But yes, it's a factor that I know anecdotally some company execs have taken very seriously under consideration.
And now we will take questions from the floor. We invite members to the microphone to ask their question. Before asking your question, please identify yourself as a City Club member and ask the question in 30 seconds or less. If I flash this question mark card, it means please wrap up your question Also, I'll read at least one question from the audience on an index card, so thank you very much. First question.
Thank you. Anthony Petchel, City Club member. You mentioned companies like Bank Simple that relocated their headquarters to Portland, and then you also mentioned companies like Jive who relocated their headquarters out of Portland. I was wondering if you can comment on those two very kind of different inbound, outbound type of companies as far as where they moved their headquarters, and where does Portland lack services, support, regulation in maintaining those companies as they grow and keeping those headquarters here?
Sure. I tend to take a lot of arrows for Jive moving their headquarters. I, for one, kind of stand behind them making that maneuver there for several reasons. One, I believe the valuation of their company on the day they had their IPO was far higher, thanks to having their headquarters in the Bay Area, and that the fact that the whatever 100, 200 engineers they have sitting in a building right over here benefited from that higher valuation. So I'm fine with that. They also were at the tail end of the last generation of startups in Portland. I would argue that a company like Simple is more on the beginning of the next generation. So Portland is starting to develop that kind of environment that's going to keep headquarters here. If you talk to Scott Kveton at Urban Airship, he is dead set against Urban Airship being anywhere but Portland as its headquarters, and we're starting to see more and more companies take a stance that reflects that. We're also starting to see more and more people just from the outside looking in at Portland as a potential place to have their headquarters. So it's starting to change, but we're very much in a transitional period, I think.
Alan Mila, City Club member. Where is higher ed in this picture?
So that's a great question. I mentioned advocacy is one of the three main areas that SAO focuses on, and across the board, when you talk about interviewing executives at software companies and saying, asking them what's the number one issue that you guys are facing that's either inhibiting or could potentially inhibit the future growth of your company, it's usually not investment capital, it's talent, and that's an issue all over the country right now. There's a lack of it. And we're doing well compared to some other markets, but you look at both the short-term need, and there's a huge a huge gap, if you will, between supply and demand. And when you look at the fact that Oregon State University graduates roughly 90 computer science graduates each year, and they get 15 job openings a week, and those are just from the companies that know about and regularly hire from those programs, that's an issue. So part of it is we need to have some increased state funding and some attention to programs that already exist and are starting to churn out, great, viable computer science, folks and engineers. And similarly, we're also looking at the fact that in the case of some of these individuals who are graduating, they maybe don't necessarily have all the skills that they need to hit the ground running. It's one of these fast growth, dynamic startups where they don't necessarily have everything in the way of a training program and an HR policy and everything else completely dialed in. And that can be daunting and overwhelming to someone who's coming right out of college to enter that environment. And so we've been looking at, as an organization, working with universities at different ways we could possibly help bridge that gap. We don't have any solutions yet, but there's a number of interesting sort of options that are on the table, and I'm hopeful that within the next year we'll start to see the formulation of at least a smaller program that we can pilot to help kind of bridge that gap between the universities and the full-time employment.
And I think another one of my concerns is we have to be even further upstream than that, like elementary school and middle school, teaching children that entrepreneurship is an actual opportunity, that it's not a mistake to become an entrepreneur, it's actually an option. And you can do that, and you should do that if you're driven to do that. At Portland Startup Weekend, which is a program designed to kind of flesh out entrepreneurs and help them determine whether they would be able to stand up a company, 2 15-year-olds pitched at Portland Startup Weekend and had products there. One of them came close to winning Portland Startup Weekend. So that should be more the norm than it is, and we should really be working to drive that learning earlier so that people do attend higher ed and do have a focus on where they're going to be in the business world.
Let me ask a question that came from the floor. As the tech community grows in Portland, are you seeing any evidence or potential for Portland losing the characteristics that differentiate it from other tech hubs?
That's a great question. I think as any economy grows and its subsectors do as well, you're going to see some change. And I would say that even in the last 10 years, if you ask someone, Rick, for example, if the tech community resembled the tech community of 10 years ago, he'd probably say, no way. So the question is, what's the sort of heart and soul in those differentiating factors? The sense of community, I would say, can still be maintained. I saw that firsthand when I was in New York in January. Had a chance to meet with the tech community and some various hackathons and other events that were going on. And what struck me was that whether I was at an event in Manhattan or in Brooklyn, the community was connected and it seemed small. There was a lot of noise, clearly, with all the other hustle and bustle going on in New York City, but the community, they knew one another from the upper echelons on down, and they had an interesting sort of series of tools available to them to connect, whether it was the New York Tech Meetup, which is 20,000 plus people who get together for events from time to time, and they listen to speakers, or whether it's working with any of the, I think, over 10 accelerator programs that in part are funded by the public sector there in New York. There's little hubs and nodes that exist all over the place. And we definitely have that here in Portland too. And in many respects, we can be quicker and faster. But even with a large-scale city, I think it's still possible to maintain that sense of community.
Yeah, I would echo that. I would just add that we have to be intentional and deliberate about conserving that. We can't just expect that to happen. So, I mean, organizations like Software Association of Oregon, Oregon Entrepreneurs Network, people who are focused on helping that community, we just need to stay focused on keeping Portland.
Hi, thanks for the conversation today. Rob Wagner, City Club member. And there's been a lot of talk about importing talent from other states. And my question is a little bit of a Homer-based question, and that is, what can high-tech startups do to partner with our area community colleges, our Oregon public universities, to provide either the middle skill jobs, which is what we're finding through the Oregon Education Investment Board and other recent research activities that demonstrate that that middle 40 in the 40-40-20 is where we really need to grow jobs in the state. So what can our tech startup companies do to provide Oregon residents and Oregon students job opportunities for the future?
Well, I think one thing is through regular work experience, through internships. Oftentimes, too, even though there's a lot of demands on employees at high-growth startups, they still can and do find the time to give back and connect with students. And clearly, the biggest impact can be had through mentorship over an extended period of time. But even something as simple as like a day in the life program. So we have a foundation at SAO, and there's a program within that called Tech Start, which focuses on STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math education at the K through 12 levels. And we had a program recently that was a day in the life. We had a panel of executives from various software companies, some of them high growth, and they talked about what it was like getting to that point in their career that they were at on that day. And it was kind of retrospective, saying if I could do some things differently, I would, and if I were in your shoes today, these are the jobs I'm hiring for and will be hiring for in the next 5 to 10 years, and here's your chance to prepare for them. And the program was set up so that even though it was hosted at PSU, there were a lot of families of kids who were in middle school and high school who were there as well, already thinking ahead, planning for, okay, what do I need to take to finish out my high school career, and then in college, and then beyond. And what's clear is that the technology that people are using today is changing rapidly. Every 2 years there's some change, some new technology. And it's the foundations that are important. How do you think critically? How do you use logic and apply it? How do you convey that enthusiasm for learning? That's what these companies are looking for on the hiring side. They can teach you the technology over time. And so I think that's the challenge for our existing educational institutions is they're teaching to a mode of working that no longer exists, at least not in software and tech. And so that's a huge challenge with a lot of complicated potential answers out there, and none of them are cheap.
And I would just add that one of the things I really value about the Portland startup community, and that I think they do very well and often don't get enough credit for, is accessibility. Like, it doesn't matter who you are or who you want to talk to in the Portland startup scene. You can pretty much drop an email to any number of CEOs or CFOs or CTOs in town, and they will find time to meet with you. Doesn't matter if you're a kid, doesn't matter if you're a business person, they make time to do that kind of stuff. And I've never seen that kind of community involvement before. I've been very impressed with it. You're not generally, if you're routed through an admin, it's generally so that that admin can actually find the time for you to have the meeting. It's not about gatekeeping or being closed off. So I think that is something that the startups are already doing that we need to learn to take advantage of and help people understand that that's available as an option. Again, I keep coming back to Kavitan, but I spend so much time with him. He's just a good example. He kind of keeps this, chunk of time available where he will meet people for coffee, just boom, 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 just so that he's meeting people in the community and ensuring that they remain connected. So I think we do really well at that, and that's something that should be championed in our community.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time for further questions and have to stop for the day. Please join us next week for Friday Forum speaker Richard Jackson, who is going to be talking about building sustainable cities. And as we close today, please join me in offering a sincere thanks to today's speakers, Skip Newberry and Rick Terozzi. Thank you very much. We are adjourned.